So Leslie, here we are. We start also recording this event that will be then YouTube in the Minerva Lab page. Just to let you know, Minerva Lab is a laboratory of ideas, an interdisciplinary laboratory of ideas, intersectional by definition. So this means that there are different disciplines represented in the laboratory. And we work in strict contact with inGenere, that is a magazine that share the same approach to gender. But we also work with a team of architect, urbanist, and engineer that is called Casa.Di. And Casa.Di stands for Care, Diversity, and Safety. Care, Safety, and Diversity. So that's why my colleagues are here with us today. So this event is co-organized basically by all of us in cooperation with Treccani Libri, so with your publisher. So I give you the floor just for a brief introduction, and then we will start the question and answers. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here among such an exciting group of panelists, and I'm looking forward to having our conversation based on the really interesting questions that Martella shared with me earlier this week. So I'm joining you today from Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada, at my office on the campus of Mount Allison University, where I'm a professor in geography and environment and women's and gender studies. I just want to say quickly thank you to Treccani Libri for your translation of the book into Italian, and today to the interpreters for all of your hard work. I know it's not easy, a job that you have to do. It's been really wonderful since the book came out, even before the Italian translation, that many Italian feminist and urban organizations have reached out to me, and it's just been so exciting to see the kind of work that people are doing in their communities, with their city governments, with their nonprofit organizations to try to make a difference in their communities and to promote feminist ideas of what city life can look like. So with that being said, I hope that that justifies a visit to Italy when the pandemic has calmed down a little bit more, so that I can meet you and some of these other groups in person one day, because I'm really, I've never been to Italy. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to connect with everyone. So I guess the reason that we're here is because of my book, Feminist City, which I initially wrote 2018, 2019 is when it first came out in Canada, and then came out in the US and UK internationally. And since then, there's obviously been a lot of big world events that have given me a lot to think about when it comes to the book. Perhaps one of the main conversations that I've been having with people is around the idea that typically urban planning and other urban design processes like architecture and perhaps even civil engineering and policymaking have not typically put women's lives anywhere near the center, and that under a kind of guise, I think, of gender neutrality, there still remains an assumption of the universal male subject as being the standard, the norm around which everything from the physical infrastructure of the city to the systems of, say, mobility and so on that flow through the city are designed around. So when we talk about the man-made city, that's one of the things that we're talking about. It's also true in most places that those remain very male-dominated professions in terms of who is actually at the top of those professions, you know, whose work is really being taken up. And it's not necessarily that the men in those positions are deliberately setting out to make life harder for women. But I like to say that it's hard to come up with solutions to problems that you don't even know about, right? So if we don't have that kind of diversity in those rooms, then there's a lot of viewpoints that are being missed. And no matter what the best intentions of planners, architects, and policymakers are, based on their own life experiences, they may not really have any sense of some of the challenges that women and other groups face in the city. So the man-made city is also a concept that expresses the way that the typical, shall we say, day-to-day patterns of this supposed universal male subject are kind of encoded in the city, whereas the fact that women tend to have different movement patterns in the city, they have different responsibilities, they may work in different sorts of locations and occupations, that's still been relatively left out or kind of an afterthought in planning. So the life of a so-called typical male commuter who comes from the suburbs or the residential area into the central city to work still guides a lot of planning principles, even though it's probably true that for many, if not most men today, that is not actually their reality either. It's maybe an old-fashioned ideal, but it's still one that is kind of built into planning. So overall, one of the points that my book tries to make is that there are just a lot of assumptions about gender roles, gender identities, a gender binary that continue to be literally built into many planning practices. One of the topics that has certainly come to the forefront since the pandemic and those initial waves of lockdowns took hold is the topic of care work. And I was excited to hear about your Casa.Di collective, thinking about care, safety, and diversity. Those are certainly key issues for me as well. When I wrote Feminist City, there are definitely some parts of the book that talk about care work and the potential of different ways of organizing care work, but I wouldn't say it was a theme that was right at the front of my mind as I was writing it. But since the book came out and since the pandemic, it has moved very much to the front of my mind and being often a topic of conversation at various, events and seminars that I've been a part of. And I think it's because the pandemic really exposed the very unstable foundation of how care work is done in most of our societies, that it is still largely unpaid, it's still done mostly by women, and it's hidden away for large part in the private space of the single family home. And so from an urban perspective, from a planning perspective, I want to push this conversation beyond where it typically goes, which is that, well, heterosexual men need to do more housework and they need to do more childcare. Now, that is definitely true. And any men listening today, I would say, if that's your situation, then there's probably more that you could be doing. But we need to move beyond this kind of battle of the sexes idea around care work and stop making it a matter that simply needs to be negotiated within heterosexual relationships and make it a much bigger question for society. And it's both a policy question. So for example, can we have publicly subsidized childcare systems, early childhood education? Can we have good paying jobs for childcare workers and domestic workers and so on? But it's also, I think, a spatial question, but again, one that doesn't typically come to the forefront in urban planning. So questions of where care work happens and where it can happen. I think, especially in North America, if I look through any major city's urban plan, it's not going to mention care work. It's just not there. All of the beautiful visions of what the city can be and all of its aims and goals, none of it really deals with care work in a meaningful way. Now, I think some European cities are a little bit ahead of us on that, in that there's a longer practice of gender mainstreaming in urban planning. But nonetheless, there's probably still a long way to go in terms of thinking about, can we use public space differently? Can we use public space, both indoor and outdoor space, for more care work activities? So to me, this means that we can bring at least some care work out of that hidden private space of the home, where the work is very easily devalued. It's not seen as very important. It's not seen as skilled work, and bring it into public space. And what that might mean is that there are better paying jobs in those fields. It might mean that care work is something that we collectively take responsibility for. It could mean that we start to value it more when we actually see it happening. It could be a way of making better use of all of the resources, both the human resources of time and energy, but also our natural resources like water, food, and so on, that go into all of the housework and care work that happens, and actually share that. There's so much, for example, food waste that happens within the home, yet there are so many people in our cities who go hungry. If we had more ways to easily share those resources, then perhaps we could balance that equation out a little bit. So one of the things that I guess I would say my 2021 take on the feminist city, now that it's been almost exactly 2 years since the book first came out in Canada, would be that care is extremely central to my idea of the feminist city. And I think I can weave arguments and thoughts about care work through any of the chapters and sections in the book that I initially wrote. But if I was writing it again today, I would probably emphasize it a lot more. That being said, I'm very happy to have our conversation touch on any of the areas of the book. We don't just have to talk about care work. I just wanted to highlight that as something that has been a really rich source of reflection for me over the past couple of years, given the really profoundly destabilizing effects of the pandemic, and it being perhaps a moment where more people are willing to take a hard look at how care is organized and the ways that our cities could do better in playing a role at actually removing some of the exploitation from care labor, and recognizing ways that we are all interdependent and need to share in that work. So I think I will pause my opening remarks there. Thank you so much for listening to that little summary of what the book was about, and I'm happy to continue our conversation.
Thank you so much, Leslie. So as you know, we have a set of questions for you, and of course, they will be put directly by my colleagues. But I want to start with a very general question. You decided to call your book Feminist City, not Care City, not Inclusive City. Of course, we like the title. We do not regret about the title, but I think it's worthwhile to stress what would be the difference between a feminist city and just a general inclusive city. What is your point of view about that? It's quite clear that a feminist city is a care city from what you said up to now. But what is the difference between a feminist city and an inclusive city? Let's start with this. Thank you.
Yes, it's a great question. I think for me, part of it is a question of vocabulary. So I find maybe it's similar where you are, but terms like diversity and inclusion, we hear these a lot in institutional and policy contexts. There are things that politicians like to talk about. There are things that even corporations like to talk about these days. But there's a lot of vagueness around really what they mean and what they stand for. I find that in my context, the Canadian context, often when we're talking about inclusion, it's about, it's a more subtle way of suggesting that people kind of assimilate to a dominant norm, right? That there are some groups who are included and some who are not, and those who are not, we need to bring them in to the existing city, the existing system, the existing community, whatever it might be, without really questioning, well, what are people being included in, right? What is this inner circle? What are the dominant norms that we are expecting, others to kind of come in and be a part of? So, as I say, it's a bit of a vocabulary question for me, and the term inclusion, I think, does not necessarily have as strong a political viewpoint to it. It's maybe something that sounds nice to more people. Some people are still very afraid of the term feminism, but I'm afraid that some of the stronger critique of the inequalities built into the city would get lost with such a term. And for me as well, I've been a feminist for, at this point, most of my life. My education is in women's and gender studies. So I come to urban studies and urban geography from a feminist point of view. That was my entry point. And that's what I know. That's actually what I feel qualified to talk about, more so even than these broader concepts like inclusion. But I think maybe part of the spirit behind your question is the fact that in many ways, both in my book and I think in gender mainstreaming policies and so on, the argument is that a lot of what we might do towards gender equity will lead to improvements for other groups of people in the city as well. So if we make spaces that are more accessible, that's great for people who have small children and are pushing baby carriages, but it's also good for senior citizens. It's good for disabled people. It's good for anyone, making deliveries. Like, there's a lot of trickle down effects, if you will. So that might be part of what the question is getting at. And I think I, in many cases, would certainly make or agree with the argument that a feminist city is an inclusive city, in that many of the things being suggested are actually meant to improve the lives of a lot of different people and not just women.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sorry I cannot put my video on because otherwise there are problems with the connection, so I apologize for this. Now Julia has a question for you. Julia Zacchia by Minerva Lab.
Yes, thank you so much, Leslie, for these presentations and for this answer. Just looking at the intersectional concept of gender, I have a question of what do you think of the issue of decolonizing the feminist city?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Again, as I speak from a Canadian context, which we call a settler colonial context, right? A place where the colonizers never left, and yet Indigenous people remain here and are, a strong and vibrant part of the country, but still remain under, in many ways, colonial control. So decolonization is very central to my thinking about the city. In urban contexts here in Canada, Indigenous women and girls face issues like violence, incarceration, and homelessness at much higher rates than other women here. Part of my belief about what makes a feminist city is the idea that we have to kind of bring the margin to the center. And in many ways, Indigenous women and girls have been some of the most marginalized people in cities in many parts of the world, not just here in Canada. So if we were to think about, what would make life better, safer, more liberating for Indigenous women, then that can really shift our perspective. We don't want to fall into the trap of making a feminist city one that is just better for privileged white middle-class women. It needs to be one that's better for women who have been historically so left out of and even actively harmed by many urban policies. I would also say it's kind of long overdue for those of us in settler colonial contexts to recognize that cities are quote unquote native land too. Land struggles are often viewed as things that are happening in rural areas or kind of remote and northern areas in Canada, where many Indigenous people do still live on reserves and so on. But urban areas are also part of traditional Indigenous territory, even though in many places Indigenous people were pushed off of the areas that became our biggest cities. So I think all city dwellers do need to see themselves as living within treaty relationships with Indigenous people, and to think critically about what issues like private property ownership, for example, environmental sustainability, like how those questions kind of intersect with ideas about decolonization. In Canada, we have a movement towards what's called land back. So like returning land, some parts of land anyways, to Indigenous control. And the argument, and it's one that I agree with, is that this perhaps might be our best way to actually survive things like the climate crisis and economic crisis and so on, if the people who were for thousands of years the stewards of this land had a chance to implement their planning practices and so on. So for me, you know, I always want to be careful. I think even in the subtitle of the US and UK version of the book, the publisher called it, you know, claiming space. And I do feel a little tension in my relationship to that term, because I'm very conscious that it's not about like taking or reoccupying space that in many cases is already occupied by colonial settlers. So that's another consideration to think about as well.
Thank you, Leslie. I can follow with another question. I don't know, maybe Marcella has some problem with the connection.
Stefania, it's fine, absolutely.
Okay.
No, absolutely, it's fine.
May I?
No,
Okay.
I just wanted to propose that just to give some rest to the interpreter, when we put the question in English, maybe we also translate our questions in Italian, so at least the interpreter can have a little rest between one question and the other, just as a matter of courtesy, if you don't mind. So Stefania, please put your question and just first in English and then in few words in Italian. So for our interpreter, it's easier.
Okay. Leslie, I loved your way of mixing scientific and autobiographical elements to talk about the complex issue of diversity and also the relevant concept of intersectionality. And I appreciated a lot your perspective in narrating events as activists beside being a scholar. And I would like to pay attention to the activity of mapping, because for planner it is a relevant activity, a relevant moment of our path. And what about mapping diversity? And in your opinion, what type of indicators could be used? In italiano la domanda centrale sarebbe di che cosa parliamo, cosa intendi per mappare la diversità, e nella tua opinione che tipi di indicatori possono essere utilizzati per diciamo, avere un buon risultato.
Thank you. You sent me a link to the mapping diversity page, and I took a little look at it, and it seemed to me that one of the things that was being mapped was like street names and perhaps monuments of different people as a way of kind of seeing where in the built environment we actually have representation, for example, of women or of maybe racial minority groups in the city, LGBTQ+ groups perhaps. And I think that that is one really interesting metric to look at, because, you know, around the world, it's very true that most places are named for men and or corporations these days as well. There are relatively few monuments to women, like to actual women. There's lots of monuments that have just sort of the female figure in general, especially if she's naked, but there's not that many monuments to actual existing or historical female figures. Whenever one of these is created, it's like a big news story in the city that has made it, right? And I think we're also seeing around the world important movements to remove certain monuments and names of places. That's definitely a big thing here in Canada and the United States, whether that's removing the statues of like Confederate war generals in the United States and slave owners, and here in Canada, removing the statues of those who were actively involved in colonization and the genocide of Indigenous people. And I think doing that is part of this, kind of process of that shift towards a more diverse representation in urban landscapes. There's also another example I was thinking of around diversity is, I think, what's called the Queer Mapping Project. That was put out a couple of years ago. I think it still exists, although many people tried to kind of hack it and ruin it, but it was like an open source map where people could kind of add their location as kind of like queer people live here, like lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans people live, in this area, and spaces that have other kind of significance to queer communities as a way of kind of saying we are here, right? We are everywhere in a way, right? Like we're not just in one neighborhood, but we're everywhere. And I think this kind of project is, useful in terms of promoting social change, because we always like to have a visual representation of something in order to convince us that either a problem is real or that something exists. In terms of, the usefulness for planners and policymakers, again, I think mapping things it makes a great argument in a way, right? Perhaps more so than tables of statistics and so on. If you're able to show something on a map, for example, just thinking about the pandemic, like the relationship between where people live and the rate of COVID infections, that can be a powerful piece of information that tells us something that policymakers would need to pay attention to, right? Even thinking back to like the 1970s in Detroit, there was what was called the Atlas of Love and Hate, and it was a mapping project that illustrated everything from where Black children were being hit by cars, by commuters through their neighborhoods. And the point was to show the public that there was, racial inequality in terms of where commuter freeways were running through Black communities. So there's a long history of this, and I do think it has potentially great persuasive value for those in power.
Great, thank you, Leslie. So I'm asking also in the chat, sorry, I just speak in Italian for a second. Ho già inserito anche in chat la disponibilità a ricevere domande, non vi preoccupate, se volete porle in italiano saremo poi noi a tradurle direttamente in inglese. Ricordo per chi è arrivato successivamente che abbiamo un servizio di interpretazione dall'inglese in italiano. Avete un mappamondo sul vostro schermo con 2 canali, inglese, che è quello ovviamente che stiamo utilizzando, ma avete anche l'opzione francese. Non sentirete parlare in francese, ma in italiano, grazie al nostro interprete. purtroppo Zoom non ci permette di scrivere italiano, non ci chiedete perché, misteri di Zoom, quindi potete tranquillamente ascoltare anche in italiano tutto quello che stiamo dicendo. So Leslie, it was just to make some points for collecting other questions and so on from our audience. Now Gabriella has a question for you.
So thank you very much for your presentation today. So I'd like to discuss with you briefly about the relationship between gentrification phenomena and the role of women. So in our imagination, gentrification in Northern America is related to the desperate housewife model, and so maybe you have a real more in-depth vision of what can be the meaning of the role of women in such areas. They improve their quality of life, but on the other side, maybe so they live in gated communities, so this could be a challenge for in our perspective. Ho domandato a Leslie la sua posizione sul tema della gentrification, quindi del trasferimento in aree periferiche di quote di popolazione, spesso in quartieri monofunzionali, nei quali migliora da un certo punto di vista la qualità della vita, ma si rischia anche il fenomeno ghettizzazione, e per le donne questo è particolarmente challenging.
Well, first I should say that my next book is all about gentrification, and it will be coming out in about 1 year from now. I finished writing it, but it's going to go through the publication process now, so we can come back and have even more of a conversation about it then. But I think during your question, you started to come to say a little bit about what, similar to what I would say about gentrification. So kind of in the 1970s and 80s, when people were first writing about gentrification, there was certainly the idea that this might be a way that women were, by moving back to the city, to try to better balance all of the multiple roles that they were juggling, especially as more women were in the paid workforce, leaving the home to work, as well as doing their unpaid work in the home. And suburban areas, especially in North America, were very isolating. There was no public transportation. Places of work were a long way away. It was just very difficult to juggle, right? Domestic work, childcare, and paid work. Whereas living in the city, things are closer together. There are more social services, schools are nearby, there's better public transportation, there's other kinds of support that would help women kind of, do that juggling act better. But what I think we've seen over, the next 30, 40 years or so is more like the problem that Gabriella is pointing to, is that this has become a privileged way of existing for some women in terms of their ability to afford to live in the central city, to the extent that living in the central city and all of the amenities of proximity that come with it has become, a commodity, right? It's become a very valuable commodity to live close to a subway station, to live close to work, to live close to your child's school. And what this has meant for probably a much greater number of women is that they can't afford to live near the very things that would make their lives easier, especially if they are low-income women, senior women, disabled women, and single mothers. Those women, in many cases, are being pushed further out of the city to find more affordable housing. They're being pushed to areas where there is not very good public transportation, where they're much less walkable because things are further apart, and there might be, big commuter roads going through. They, become dependent on cars to get to and from their work. They don't have as much time with their children. And things are becoming, less and less affordable overall. There's less social services, less daycare centers, all of those kinds of things. So to me, I think it's quite possible that some women have benefited and felt empowered by gentrification, but the majority of women, I think, are being negatively affected. And certainly, as I was writing my latest book, one of the things that I was talking about was how women are very vulnerable, for example, to harassment from their landlords, right, when they're renters. And landlords will sexually harass women tenants. Women are more vulnerable to being evicted, especially single mothers, than other groups of people. Women, when housing is not affordable, women can stay trapped in domestic violence situations because they can't afford to leave and find their own housing. So gentrification, I think, overall produces a situation that is really very dangerous for a lot of women, because without access to, safe, good quality, affordable housing, many women end up trapped in very dangerous and sometimes violent housing situations.
Thank you. I keep us posted about your new book.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. You're already invited. So now Barbara De Micheli from inGenere wants to put a question.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I think the question is very much linked to the discussion you just had now. I mean, my interest was about when you talk about suburbs, so the areas where these low-income women are pushed, you say that in a way suburbs are the infrastructures for the gender division of labor, no? But what we see now from the pandemic and also the lockdown is that especially in big cities, we see it very clearly in Rome, the center of the city is in a way suffering more than the suburbs, because people are staying more time in the suburbs and they are in a way revitalizing these areas more than the centers, probably linked also to the phenomenon of gentrification. So my question is, can we hope, or do you see that the pandemic can be a way to, or these phenomena can bring to a more feminist city? So can we hope that an effect of the lockdown would be to have suburbs or cities that are more near to a feminist view of the city? E rapidamente in italiano, sulla scia di quello che è stato discusso finora, abbiamo visto che Leslie nel suo libro dice appunto che le periferie in qualche modo sono una costruzione fisica della divisione dei ruoli di genere che relega le donne alle attività di cura nella periferia, però noi abbiamo visto che con la pandemia in realtà sono quasi più i centri delle città a soffrire per la mancanza di persone, mentre le periferie dove le persone rimangono più a lungo si stanno rivitalizzando. Quindi chiedevo se possiamo sperare che un effetto, diciamo, di questo cambiamento sia una visione più femminista della città.
Yes, thank you. I think we can be hopeful in that whenever there are moments where things are very destabilized and shaken up, there is definitely a chance for something new to emerge. And, it's no secret that the pandemic has been very hard on women in many ways. So it's estimated that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of women have lost their jobs around the world. They've either, not had work because their industries like service work, tourism, restaurants, and so on were, really hard hit by all of the restrictions of the pandemic. And many women also felt that they had to leave their jobs because they suddenly had to take on the task of like homeschooling their children effectively, maybe looking after sick relatives, dealing with a lot more home-based responsibilities, and it was basically impossible for some women to juggle their paid work and all of those responsibilities. So in that context, we have this real shakeup where things are bad in many ways, but it can be a moment perhaps where people start to question things that we have taken for granted. So for example, we could question the single family home as the dominant unit of housing in so many of our countries and cities. I think we've taken for granted that that is the right way to organize society, that it's how everybody wants to live. But really, it's a relatively recent phenomenon, and it's certainly not the universal reality. Not every culture in the world lives in this way. But we keep building as if that was the case, even though so many people are single for much longer parts of their lives than they were 50 years ago. People have blended families. People get divorced at high rates and start new families. There's all sorts of changes to family configurations that happen, but our housing doesn't really support it. So it could be a moment where we think about not completely getting rid of single family housing. People will always want that, but can we diversify what we offer? Can we present more options for people to live in intergenerational or multi-generational homes? Can we promote more co-housing or cooperative housing projects where people can share more common space and share responsibilities for cooking, childcare, elder care, household maintenance, laundry, all of those things that are so isolating. I think it's also a moment where we can rethink public space. In my earlier remarks at the beginning, I was talking about, can we imagine using our cities in different ways? And I think we might have to, as Barbara, as you pointed out, in many ways, central cities are suffering because there are not all of the workers going to and from that there were before. So what are we going to use these spaces for? Can we be creative and think about more integrated communities again, like bringing more of a mix of residential and work and leisure and consumption and school and services and care all together in the city? This could be a moment where we take advantage of that opportunity. I think it's also important to kind of link in sustainability questions to that as well, because this could be a chance to move away from some of the very environmentally unsustainable or inefficient ways of organizing cities. So, driving cars and fossil fuels is a big one, but also I think the single family home is not a very energy efficient way to exist. And with the climate crisis and so on, we're going to be forced to make big changes. So why don't we be proactive and try to do that before we're in a truly apocalyptic situation and make some changes a little earlier than on. So short answer, yes, I'm hopeful that there can be change. I'm hopeful that many women will say, you know what, we're not going to be put in this position again of having to choose between our work and our families. We need something different. And that will compel governments to take action and to provide some of those things that many of them have promised for a long time, like universal childcare and paid leave and all of those things that are so important for women and families.
Thank you, Leslie. Just few remarks, once again in Italian, just few seconds. Siamo davvero dispiaciute che purtroppo Facebook non trasmette il nostro audio. Quindi abbiamo messo su Facebook il link al webinar, anche se ovviamente c'era già, e nel frattempo vedo che si stanno quindi aggiungendo delle persone che probabilmente provengono da quel canale. Siamo davvero dispiaciute di questo inconveniente, abbiamo fatto ben 3 prove e ha sempre funzionato, quindi è un mistero del come mai Zoom oggi non permette la diretta su Facebook tramite StreamYard. Abbiamo fatto tantissimi tentativi, ringrazio Jacopo per tutti i tentativi che sta facendo, ma purtroppo oramai dobbiamo rinunciare, quindi chiedo anche a Jacopo di chiudere la diretta perché è inutile in questo modo. Mi sentite? Sì? E quindi però ricordo a tutte che la registrazione verrà poi resa disponibile su YouTube e potrà essere caricata sulle pagine Facebook ovviamente di inGenere e di Treccani Libri. Siamo davvero dispiaciuti. We are really sorry, Leslie, we have problems with the streaming on Facebook, unfortunately. So there are some people that are joining us right now because they are moving from Facebook into the webinar. Ho dimenticato solo una cosa per chi si è aggiunto nel frattempo: abbiamo un canale di interpretazione aperto, quindi potete ascoltare tutto quello che diciamo anche in italiano, semplicemente scegliendo l'opzione francese dal mappamondo dell'interpretazione. I'm just saying that there is an interpretation going on, Leslie. So now we have a question by Annunziata Dorazio. Please, Nuccia.
Eccomi. Maybe you said something about this, but a city of short distances can today be defined a city for women because women have typical modes of movement, also due to their typical activities, for example, housekeeping, and you say this, no? In addition to the work at Saudi, calling for a more women-friendly city based on this argument maybe implies the risk of fixing women to a destiny that is caregiving is female. You mentioned this issue in the book and you said something at the beginning of your presentation. Would you like to add anything today? Because I say this because at the other hand, I find very interesting your talk about the body, women, all people in the city. Marcella often talks about the P gap in addition to the pay gap for the women in the city. Thank you very much.
Yes, indeed, the P gap is my invention, but as a matter of fact,
dare
it's
una
quite clear what
spiegazione
it
in
means.
italiano, nel senso che ho chiesto a Leslie se questo enfatizzare la città delle piccole distanze che permette alle donne di fare un po' tutto relativamente alla loro tipica vita, in realtà poi le fissa un destino, appunto, la scuola dei figli, il caregiving, eccetera, eccetera. Io trovo molto interessante invece nel libro di Leslie la parte che enfatizzava il corpo, che è una cosa essenziale, cioè una donna incinta è una donna incinta, non dipende dal lavoro che fa e dalla vita, cioè una donna incinta deve trovare il suo spazio e il suo agio nel muoversi nella città. E ho citato l'invenzione di Marcella che invece di parlare di oltre a parlare di pay gap per le donne parla di P gap, cioè l'impossibilità delle donne di percorrere con agio lunghe distanze nella città perché non possono, diciamo, espletare bisogni fisiologici. Grazie.
Yes, thank you. I think to me, the first part of your question was maybe getting at the idea that it's possible maybe to, if we design a city that's just meant to help women juggle care work and paid work, then we're not actually doing very much to change the status quo. We're still making assumptions that this is women's labor and that most women are or will be mothers or caregivers. And I agree, I do think that's a danger. And I think I talked a little bit about that in the book, that ultimately the goal is not just to make it a little bit easier for women to do all of the stuff that they have to do. And as I said earlier, it's not also my goal to convince individual men to change their behavior, although they can also do that, that's fine. But to think about, how do we design both systems and spaces that make it possible to alleviate that exploitation, right? And it's also not just about women, because many people who do care work for money do it under very bad working conditions for very little money and with very little respect. So we have to be thinking more broadly about kind of transforming our priorities so that care work is really taken seriously as a public good and a public necessity, not as something that is secondary to what we call the economy that we were all asked to kind of sacrifice ourselves for the pandemic, but recognizing that that economy doesn't exist without care work, and we can't completely rely on this exploitative system to keep it going. Maybe the second part of your question, thinking about bodies and maybe the definition of women and women's embodied experiences in cities. Well, like Marcella, I could probably talk about the P gap and bathrooms all day. And it's also been a topic that has come up a lot when I talk about feminist city, because it does point to, I think, something I mentioned earlier, which is still this idea that there is like a normative, universal male body that is assumed to be the person who's moving about the city. We're not taking into account the needs of pregnant people, people who are breastfeeding, people who menstruate, people who have disabilities, for example, Crohn's disease, or any condition that makes you need the bathroom on a regular basis. We're not considering disabled people's access needs, the needs of senior citizens, or the needs of little children who, either need their diapers changed or need the bathroom when they need it. So it's not all about bathrooms, but it points to this bigger question of kind of who we assume the city is for and what kinds of activities we assume happen in cities. And I think the pandemic was a good illustration of this, again, as in many places, our governments told us to go outside more, right? You should socialize outside, it's safer. But we went outside and there's nowhere to sit, there's nowhere to get water, there's nowhere to go to the bathroom, there's no shade, there's no shelter. I'm exaggerating a bit, but especially in a lot of North American cities, we've taken away that infrastructure because we're afraid of homeless people and crime and drug use. And we've made very inhumane cities where people's bodily needs, our needs just as human beings, are not taken into account. So for me, a feminist city has to be one that does think about the body, because that means that we're starting from a human-centered perspective, right? Cities are not just for cars and financial transactions, they are for people with bodies. But we often forget that, I think, in a lot of planning and policy making.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you so much, really. Now we start with the questions from the audience. I invite Giulia Porino, a member of Minerva Lab, to ask her question now.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much, Marcella, for giving me the floor, and thanks a lot for organizing this. So I must say and apologize because I haven't had the chance to read the book yet. I promise I will remedy to that. But by listening to what you were saying, I was wondering the role of, because you're describing how it should be. So I'm trying to make like maybe an intellectual jump and saying, okay, how we make it possible. And my guess is that here the role of gender budgeting could play an important part, also given the wave of importance that the digital and green transition is having in terms of also reforming and like a concept of smart cities, but also the way in which local government govern themselves, but also interact with the citizens. So to have a real sustainable way of interacting with citizens and to have a true inclusive sort of transformation, we have to go through also the diversity and gender dimension. So I was wondering if in writing your book and also writing the next one, you are also thinking about that, and if you have an opinion about that. And also, in a way, gender budgeting is very much into the hand of financial ministers or finance people also within the government. So how it's possible to also like promote this idea and even, in a more like assertive way, like hammering this idea in their head in order to make sure that they take it when implementing the transformations of the cities and the urbans and etc. Thanks a lot. In Italian, very quickly. Allora, intanto mi scusavo perché non ho avuto modo ancora di leggere il libro e cercherò di rimediare al più presto. La mia domanda, ascoltando la presentazione e le cose dette anche sulla questione dell'housing, per esempio, dell'housing sociale, era relativamente a come rendere possibile questa trasformazione delle nostre città, anche in base alla trasformazione digitale e verde, ecologica, che è un po' sulla bocca di tutti, ma che sta anche un po' diciamo guidando tutto il discorso anche a livello di governance, quindi di gestione regionale e locale, e quindi anche a livello delle nostre città, quindi in Europa tutta e nel mondo intero in realtà. Quindi appunto mi chiedevo se nella scrittura di questo libro o anche nello studio del prossimo ci fosse anche una riflessione su come rendere il gender budgeting veramente parte del gender mainstreaming, e anche come sensibilizzare quelli che sono poi le autorità che si occupano di gender budgeting più a livello di amministrazione, e che quindi sono ad esempio il Ministero delle Finanze o appunto il Ministero dell'Economia. Grazie mille.
It's interesting because gender budgeting, I think, is still very marginal here in North America. It's not something that is, commonly practiced, especially at the city level. So more of what I've learned about gender budgeting has been looking at European cities, but it's, as I say, it's not really part of the context here. I do think it is one important method for, as you said, Julia, how do we get from here to there, to the future vision? Because where a city or a society puts its money reflects its priorities, right? What we choose to invest money in is a signal of what we value and what we consider to be important. So gender budgeting exercises can help both make clear what the current priorities are and how they might be skewed or biased towards certain kinds of priorities or groups or needs, and how they might be leaving out others. I think it's also important, you mentioned things like the smart city, kind of green city, those sorts of things. It's important to take a gender budgeting or gender equity perspective to those projects, because we, in many cases, it seems like cities are very excited about these things. Ooh, smart city, digital city, 15-minute city, green city, whatever you might call it. And they're happy to kind of jump on board with these new agendas without maybe taking the time to really explore the equity implications, both for women, but also perhaps for racial minorities, for seniors, disabled people, other disadvantaged groups in society. So for example, one of the things that people seem to be really embracing is like the idea of active transport. So bicycles and electric bicycles, scooters and electric scooters. And in lots of cities here in Canada, they've really been excited to roll these out. Oh, this is so much healthier for people. They'll be more active. It's a great way to get around. It's better than cars. Yes, all of that is true. But without an equity view, you miss a lot of the potential problems or conflicts from these. So one thing to note is that in many places, women bicycle less than men because they feel less safe doing so. So does your bicycling plan have a gender safety perspective built into it? Women are still more likely to be doing caregiving journeys. So do your bicycle lanes make room for children or for bikes that are pulling a trailer with children in them? People have found that with the electric scooters that people just rent them and then they leave them lying on the sidewalk. So they're blocking the path of pedestrians and especially people with strollers or people using wheelchairs. Like it becomes very hazardous to have these. And for example, the city of Montreal actually had to ban the e-scooters after they brought them out because they found that they just became more of a headache than anything else. Someone was telling me this story of a city in Northern Europe where they were very excited to have electrified their entire bus fleet for environmental purposes. That's great. No diesel buses, it's all electric. But their research had found that actually they could have achieved the same environmental savings if they had just convinced an equal number of men to ride the bus as women, right? So there was like a social component to it as well. You know, we have to think really broadly about like what our interventions are targeting and what they're leaving behind. So maybe I've gone on a bit of a tangent from your question there. You know, and perhaps the answer to the question of like, okay, it's all the finance ministers making these decisions. Do we trust them to do, you know, good gender equity budgeting? Maybe not. I mean, that's another argument, I guess, for increased representation and diversity in those spaces, because as I said earlier, that finance minister might not be able to come up with a budget solution to a problem that he doesn't know exists. So that lack of diversity is probably not helpful when it comes to realizing the full potential of gender budgeting exercises. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. So now we have another question from the audience. Eugenia Benigni has actually written the question, but please take the floor.
Yes, thank you very much for this initiative tonight. I loved the book through and through, and I spread it through to a friend of mine who is an engineer and who does urban planning projects in development, international cooperation and development programs. So I'm really looking forward to your next book. My question is, when I read a book, of course, I always reflect upon the I reflect about the context where the author is writing, and I really enjoyed that you talked about your personal experience and your and the Canadian context or the local context where you have lived and worked. and also as well some European good practices like Vienna and Stockholm and elsewhere in Sweden. And I was wondering if you can share maybe one or two more good practices in Europe, or recommend further reading. And I will summarize my question in Italian now. Allora, innanzitutto ho ringraziato Leslie per il bellissimo libro, e la mia domanda è appunto, dato che nel libro lei menziona alcune buone pratiche in Europa, tra cui la città di Vienna e Stoccolma e altre città svedesi, se poteva condividere un altro paio di esempi di buone pratiche in Europa o consigliare ulteriori letture. Grazie.
Thank you. I suspect that many of you could answer this question better than I can, but from what I have, been reading and learning and talking with people about, one example is the city of Barcelona, which does have a gender, I forget the exact wording, but it's a gender planning perspective that is part of their urban plan. And as part of that, they have, methodologies for community engagement and for engaging women in the planning process. So those involve, gathering groups of people together from the community to imagine and envision changes. They also use practices similar to what we call safety audits, which involves groups of people actually going out into the neighborhood, walking around at different times of day and night and looking for features of both the built and the social environment that contribute to feelings of safety or fear. So that could be, okay, there's not enough light over here, or on this corner, there's always, young men skateboarding and I can't walk there with my children, those kinds of daily life-based observations that can really help planners get a sense of not just like the bird's eye view of space and how things, connect and move together, but how people actually use it on a day-to-day basis and how they feel in those spaces, right? Because the emotional component matters, but that's not something easily captured in a plan or a diagram. So safety audits, community engagement, they're talking about school mobility plans, which I think is really interesting as well, like in recognition that actually the movement to and from school is a big part of urban mobility, but it's maybe considered secondary to movement to and from work. Yet often the timing of this does overlap and it can create conflicts and safety problems for children and families if we have all of this car traffic or if car traffic is prioritized over school mobility. So thinking about making school mobility a higher priority and really recognizing the ways in which other changes that you might make can impact the lives of women and children in terms of getting to and from school is an important step. So I realize that is all from Barcelona. I'm trying to think of other European examples. I mean, one, this is not so much a practice that's in place, but it's addressing the issue of the way that girls are often left out of consideration in planning for like public space and leisure activities. So in the United Kingdom, there's an organization called Making Space for Girls, which is working with various municipalities to try to come up with creative ways to make sure that girls are feel included and that their needs are being recognized when it comes to designing, say, parks and recreational spaces, because we see a lot of basketball courts or soccer pitches baseball, sports related activities, then it's not that girls don't like to do these things, but they often kind of lose out in competition to the boys to actually access those spaces. Girls are also subject to often more controls by their parents in terms of what kinds of public spaces they go to and so on. So really getting them involved in making public space and getting cities to recognize that girls have been left out and really underrepresented is something that they're working on. So again, it's called Making Space for Girls. And yeah, those are a couple of examples I can think of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. In the meantime, I put in the chat, I apologize, these are in Italian, but for those, for our audience and for Eugenia especially that put that question, I put in the chat the link to a dossier by inGenere with several articles concerning gender and the city and feminist city as well, especially the last article that we published by Barbara De Micheli is really a playlist about also an experience that is Sex and the City. But I wonder, Barbara, if you want to say something about that. But anyway, you can certainly follow on inGenere through the link that I sent. As a matter of fact, we were supposed to have also a question by another colleague of ours, Sonia, that unfortunately cannot be with us because she was suddenly involved in other duties in her university. So I wonder whether Alessandra wants to say something about what Sonia had in mind.
Much, Marcella. I would like to stress one specific point that you were talking about till now, the idea of a public space. Actually, maybe for us that live in the Euro-Mediterranean area, the concept of public space is not the same that is shared in North America. Actually, if I think to one book by Richard Sennett, he was talking about the public space, and it was a shopping mall and an art gallery that was on the first floor in New York, the Lever House, for instance. And it is something, both are something that absolutely are not public space in our idea, in our concept. For us, what is a public space is a place in which we can meet even casually, even for without a specific purpose. And the idea is an idea that especially stresses in diversity, which is actually one of our keywords. Our network is made of safety, diversity, and care. And in the case of Sonia, who's not here, we were discussing together with Sonia some experiences that we know very well, very closely in Sassari city, the city in which her school, which is the Fine Arts Academy, and my university take place. Actually, related to the matter of safety, we noticed that in one district of the town, the ancient part of the town, there was a matter of fear, which is typical in, especially in USA, as a matter of urban design. But this matter of fear was coped by women, especially by women. At the end, the groups were made by women and men. But the starting point was decided by women in different experiences in forms of reappropriation of degraded spaces that were formerly populated by criminals, and reconquering these spaces by using public activities, social public activities made especially of art and culture. Would it be something that could be shared in Canada in your own experience, or in general in North America? I cannot share I know maybe I can share my screen if you want to see some images of these experiences I am I am talking about just a moment, but if you want to start to discuss about this topic, I will appreciate. I go on with a slideshow while you are working, Leslie. This is one of these promenades in Sassari, which were related to literature. They started visiting places in which some crimes had taken place, so that some women like these were joking about this idea of crime scene in a place and started moving people across and through these squares, streets, buildings. At the beginning, they were more or less 30 people, and they were 300. And this year, even though the pandemic and the lockdown, they restarted. This was the leader of the group of these women. You can see, even if the street is very narrow, they have called so many people that this year, even though the pandemic was forcing us to a lockdown, they, wearing the masks, restarted this kind of experiences. This is just an example. So I would like to stress this idea of reconquering the space and make it become safer by the initiative of women.
Yes, I really agree with that as a method in general, because too often what we hear from cities is that they're going to increase the number of police in public space. And I have a lot of objections to this. One is that it probably makes public space much more dangerous for racial minorities, homeless people, low-income people, sex workers, and so on. And the other objection is that I don't think it actually makes anything safer for women in general either. We know that when bad things happen to women and they go to the police, it's often not taken seriously. Very rarely are people actually charged with crimes against women, given how regular those crimes happen. And most violence against women happens in the home. And the police don't do anything about that meaningfully either. So I could go on and on about that, but I will come back to the point about, women actively taking up space and relying on one another and relying on a collective sense of safety, I think is so much more productive. And in fact, it's what women have been doing for a very long time. It's not even that it's new, but we kind of keep rediscovering it in I think, good ways. I think it also speaks to the fact that, women, one of the positive aspects of kind of gendered socialization is a sense of care for others that tends to be more of a assumed to be a feminine trait, right? Or it's more socialized into women to behave in that way. But we can see that kind of playing out in good ways when women say, no, we want to take care of each other. We care about each other's safety. And in general, I think the principle of trying to make a space safer by changing the way that people use it is a really solid one. It's probably much more effective than the kind of design interventions that we can imagine, which are fairly limited. And I'd like to think that if better lighting and, better sight lines could solve violence against women or violence in the city, then it would have happened already. But those things only go so far. It's much more, I think, about the human environment of the city, about what kinds of people are in that space, about what activities are happening, and about having like a diversity of activities. So we know that kind of single-use spaces often they're not used 24/7. They're not very welcoming to diverse groups of people. So the more diversity of use, whether that's places to sit, places for children to play, places to buy a cup of coffee, cultural activities, theater happening, sports, all sorts of things kind of in close proximity to one another are probably more likely to make people feel safe than any amount of, fences or any amount of police could do in that environment. So I think that's a great example, and thank you for sharing it with me.
We also have other examples, but it would take too much time. So it will be an idea if we will have another opportunity to share again this kind of experiences. Thank you very much for accepting our invite.
Thank you, Alessandra. I wonder whether Barbara wants to say something about Sex and the City.
Well, it was just a very interesting course. I started the year with. It was not organized by inGenere. I just followed as a student, but it was very interesting because it was an overview on the gender dimension of cities, and I had a lot of references, including your book. And I think that it was really interesting because when we live in the city, we usually see a lot of constructions or directions as given, and we are not used to question them. So for me, the main result of the course was to get some questions to investigate the space, and there were a lot of very interesting contributions on that. Yeah, that was basically the effect of the course. Yeah, thank you, Marcella.
Oh, you're welcome. Another experience that we reported on inGenere is about an app that is called Where, that has been developed by some young web designers. And it's really a crowd mapping used in several cities now here in Italy. If you want, we can send you some details about that. And it's a way of women to interact with space through digital tools, warning each other in case of course, of specific risk or safety problems, but also is a way of, as Alessandra was saying, to occupy the space and become owner of the space at the same time. So we can send you definitely some sources for this. In Italian stavamo giusto ricordando e comunque ho inserito il link anche nella chat, un'interessantissima esperienza che è quella delle warriors, che noi amiamo molto su inGenere, quindi queste iniziative di crowd mapping dal basso, iniziative prese da giovani web designers che permettono l'interazione tra donne negli spazi urbani, non soltanto allo scopo di segnalare eventuali pericoli, ma anche di riappropriarsi di questi spazi. Quindi è in forma digitale proprio quello che Alessandra prima raccontava invece dell'esperienza sassarese di persona. Visto che sentiamo tanto parlare di digitalizzazione, vale la pena anche ricordare questi esempi che andrebbero sicuramente incentivati e finanziati. Sorry for the Italian, Leslie. I was just reporting about the warriors, as we call them, here in Italy. So there are just 5 minutes left. So unless there are some comments from the audience or from all the colleagues. There was just one question that I sent to Leslie in advance, but unfortunately Sonia was not here to put the question itself, and is about the lack of images in your book. That is somehow surprising. So we're just curious about that. Was that a choice? Was just that an agreement with your publisher in order to avoid higher costs for publication? Please just let us know what is your idea in terms of putting images for each of your chapters.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I was probably being conscious of the costs and also that going through the process of getting permission to use images can be time consuming and difficult. So unless I could take those images myself, it might be very difficult to include them. But your question was a very welcome one. It definitely got me thinking. And certainly over the past year and a half, because I've given so many presentations, I've made a lot of PowerPoint presentations with images. So I've had to kind of do that work afterwards. So just very quickly, my answers to the questions of what I would maybe have as a signature image for each of my chapters. Probably for City of Men, I would have a skyscraper as that kind of quintessential image of male power and dominance over urban space. For City of Moms, again, a very often used image of a woman carrying a baby stroller down a flight of steps into a subway tunnel. That would be a good one. For City of Friends, I would probably think about like an image of people living in co-housing, or maybe just the television show The Golden Girls, and the sharing that the 4 older women did in their Florida condo. For City of One, maybe an image of a woman wearing headphones and trying to navigate through a busy, crowded urban space. For City of Protest, I think over the past year, one of the very profound images of protests that we've seen is people tearing down statues in cities that don't represent the values that they want to see expressed. And I think that we've seen examples of that all over the world. So I think that would be a great one. City of Fear, for this one, I was thinking about it would be interesting to juxtapose images of the home and the street or the dark alley, because as I mentioned a minute ago, the home is a tremendous site of violence against women, and yet we don't really talk about that when we talk about women and fear. But I do think we need to think about violence against women in public and private spaces together as part of the same larger phenomenon and not treat them as distinct. So I would put those together. And then finally, for City of Possibility, I'm not sure, but I would say something joyful and celebratory, because ultimately I don't think of the feminist city as just a project of critique or of tearing things down, but of kind of speculative imagining of a different future, and a future where people are really thriving and enjoying life in the city. Those would be my choices.
Well, thank you so much, Leslie. We are perfectly in time. We are closing this seminar now. I must say, as Minerva Lab, we are really proud to have started our autumn session of seminars with you, but also proud of having here with us today our friends from Casa.Di and from inGenere. And of course, we are really sorry that Treccani Libri was not involved on Facebook. We will certainly send them the registration of the event, and they will share on Instagram and Facebook as well. So we really hope to have you here with us for your next book. Feel free to contact us, of course, not only if you come to Italy, but in general, and we would certainly read you for time being. We'll keep on posting about Feminist City, and for the future, we will follow you in your new adventures. Thank you so much, really. And grazie a tutte per essere qui con noi oggi. Grazie.
Grazie a tutti. Viva Minerva.
It was wonderful to be here. Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
And thank you so much to our interpreter, of course. Thank you.
Thank you.